Thank you for coming. What I'm going to talk about here in this paper is an initiative that I have with a colleague at the University of Sydney. I'm a technologist, I'm a computer scientist, so I'm all about algorithms and numbers and quantitative analysis. He's an educational psychologist and therefore is about, feelings and emotions and quantitative things. So over the years, well, year and a half, we've been having these discussions and they're very productive because we disagree most of the time, but those discussions are precisely sometimes or reflect the tension, not the tension, but the multidisciplinary flavor that this conference has. So this is our attempt to try to see if we reconcile both worlds. And it's a small attempt, it's just an initial work, but it tries to convey a little bit the type of issues we're finding. So the problem we are trying to tackle is the following. On one hand, we have this community that is focused on comprehensive data capture without, you might have with or without, in our case, let me put it on the extreme, without asking the students anything. We just, give them some context, put some sensors there, we collect data, and then we'll see what we get from there. On the other side, what we have are these much more theoretical analysis in which people think about how students create knowledge, the mental processes that take you there, and also try to think about how to unpack the way things happen in the student's brain. And again, from this dichotomy is precisely the type of thing we're trying to do, just to make sure that this is aligned with the spirit of the conference. In 2013, that reference over there, that reference you see there are the two program chairs, and they identify this area and they call it the middle space. And I don't know if you've said in some other sessions, but this notion of the middle space keeps coming back in this conference, and it's precisely because of this reason. So let me start trying to summarize. My colleague is called Rob, I forgot to mention. This is some work we did together, Rob, myself, and Feifei, master's student. So from Rob's angle, and my angle would be the technology, from Rob's angle, we wanted to focus on one specific aspect theory of learning, which is self-regulation. We could have picked some other models, but when trying to unpack this tension between quantitative and qualitative or theory and data-driven, we chose one aspect which I think most of us here can relate to. And self-regulation, you might know something about it, but I'm not sure. Self-regulation, I think that the part we found that it was much more relevant is because it connects very quickly with certain ingredients that are everyday instances of what happens with the students. They have to reflect on what is happening, they have to follow a strategy, they have to make decisions. These decisions typically get evaluated over time. Sometimes the tutors or the instructors end up evaluating yourself. So we do have a lot of ingredients that are used in this self-regulation. The other thing that and this is from my angle, I'm teaching a first year course and I see these type of issues staring me at the face, the motivation of the students. The students are not motivated, and I see also sometimes my students making poor decisions, and I see sometimes my students not reflecting a lot, and all of a sudden when I think about self-regulation, I see some of these issues. So from that point of view, this is something also that I need to be aware of. So this first model, and we have the experts in the room, so I'm going to be extremely careful. This model unpacked all these elements, and it offers a lot of valuable information about what should be talking or what should be tackling. It has this notion of the task. So students are given a task. This task has certain conditions. This task has resources. Sometimes we frame the task in a specific way. We are pushing our students towards self-reflection or towards thinking about how they are approaching or towards their strategies. And this is the type of things we have to take into account. Students end up producing some sort of evidence, and this evidence is typically what we look at and evaluate or assess, and then we typically go back to them and say, oh, you see, you wrote this and it's not appropriate, or we're not happy with the way you wrote, or maybe it's just an assignment that says 3.5, and they have to go from there. But those are the typical elements of our model that we need to pay attention to. There are other models, and I'm not going to elaborate too much about it because I think we are making the point, but this is just to highlight that when we talk about self-reflection and we come from the point of view of the theory, there is a variety of models, and each one of them highlights different aspects. But the trick I think we are finding between Rob and myself and and Feifei Han is that it is difficult for us in learning analytics to establish the connection between this theoretical model and what is actually that we need to capture, and what is the relationship, and do these things affect each other. I think this is still a space that needs to be explored a little bit further. And that's basically the objective of this contribution. So from the side of technology, and this is the part that I feel a bit more comfortable with, I think we can make a lot of progress on trying to observe students while they are working. So it's not only, I'm going to have a midterm and some assessments and I'm going to collect the scores. I think we can go beyond that, and this conference has proven the progress we've made in the last years. We can observe the process, and I think observing the process is what really makes much more relevant looking then at the theoretical models, because whatever we observe from the process will definitely have a connection. And what I mean by that is, if my student is reading a document, well, maybe we can track that reading. Or if they are writing a document and there's been other presentations in the conference, maybe we can track how the structure of that document evolves. And therefore, we're looking at the process quantitatively. And therefore, the potential is we combine both of them. So for this presentation, what we're trying to unpack is the relationship between the capacity of the students to self-regulate, and we're going to measure that with an instrument, and combine it or see what is the relationship with the digital footprints. And we're going to use a very concrete case study for that. And what we're trying to answer, and it's not a question that we fully answer because it's a concrete case study, is can these two things be combined, and how? What kind of things can we do about it? All right, so let me give you very quickly a brief description of the scenario. Rob and myself, when we have these discussions about what should they do, he's much more in the theory realm, and therefore he feels comfortable in front of a board and scribbling things. I am an engineer. I feel much more comfortable when I go down and measure things and get results. So we had to agree on focusing on a specific scenario and see these two angles in action. And this specific scenario is a course that was run last semester. Topic is computer systems, but it's not that relevant. It doesn't affect that much what we are doing. Perhaps the most relevant thing is it's a blended learning strategy. So students have to do quite a substantial amount of things in the online space, and there you see the opportunity for us to collecting these data and try to connect it with the self-regulation model. We meet 7 hours face-to-face, so as you can see, it's quite an intense course, but the additional load that we estimate is another 5 to 6 hours additional in the blended space. And to give you a flavor a little bit, and I'll go a little bit more on the details, the online component is, I would say, important. It's 15%. And we ran this experiment with 145 students. Okay, so first, what kind of instrument did we use to measure self-regulation? And this was already a tricky issue because there are many ways of doing this, and we ended up doing something that is fairly standard. We picked this instrument published by Pinterich a few years back that measures quite a lot of things. This is the Motivated Strategies for Learning questionnaire. It has, I believe, from the top of my head, I'm not going to say the exact number, 64 questions, I believe. And it's measured in 5 dimensions, but one of them is self-regulation, and that's what we picked. Okay? The example is over there. These are basically questions that are given to the students, and students self-report answers to those questions. After yesterday's keynote, when it was said that self-reported information is totally useless, I probably need to review a little bit this, but that's okay. Maybe I'll publish something on the Failathon next year then, saying that this is useless. But, and each question has a 7-point Likert scale answer. So this was a question we gave our students in the middle of the semester. And out of that questionnaire with 64 questions, 9 of them are specifically to self-regulation. And this is what we focused on, okay? The digital footprint, and here is, again, where I feel a bit more comfortable. We tried to do a very comprehensive capture of what happens in that digital space. And for that, what we did is all the activities were designed in a way that had an HTML format. They were given on the LMS. And pretty much everything that happened in the course needed to happen in that platform, or in that space, if you will. Even the interaction during lectures. So when you go to a lecture, you do have a script of the lecture. I don't use PowerPoints, we do active learning, but that's irrelevant. You still have tasks that they have to perform. My students have their digital devices in front of them, and they keep consulting these activities while we are in the lecture. And the same thing applies for the tutorial, and the same thing applies for the laboratory session. Now, how much of the learning process are we capturing here? Probably not the whole thing, but as you can see, we are aiming towards comprehensive capturing of this digital footprint. So we have I don't know, 1.7 million of events, and each one of them, you could call it a click stream. It's a little bit more sophisticated than a click stream because it also gives you information if the answer was correct or incorrect to the exercise, if they are reading a section in a document because they unpack it or pack it again. This is HTML accordion style, if you're familiar with that. But anyway, we end up with a fairly rich set of events. Now, the other step we took, and here there are lots of other heuristics out there, we took a simple one is, all right, we have all these different types of events. We are going to take one more level of sense making, and we're going to count the number of each category of events for each student. So the digital footprint, to give you a more precise idea, is a huge matrix. Each row of the matrix is a student, and each column of the matrix is the count of the number of events for different variety of things that it happens online. Okay, so we have these two ingredients, the self-reported, self-regulation, and the event counts. A little bit more information about the context. I told you that the the online component was worth 15%. This is just to give you an idea of the scenario we are trying to do here. The academic performance that we are measuring, and we're measuring with respect to the whole course, it's broken into these pieces. So this is basically the type of thing. This is the first thing my students care about, right? When they sign up in the course, what is it going to happen here? So yeah, there is a midterm somewhere here. Where's my midterm? Here. Midterm, there is a final exam, some report that they have to write, some preparation for the online component, and some other online component in there. And this is, for us, the dependent variable. This is what we're looking for. Can we combine self-regulation and online or digital footprint information and explore the relationship with academic performance in these terms, in this course, in this environment? So 3 steps we took for the analysis. The first one is, even though the instrument we use had 9 components, and the 9 components were supposedly asking students to self-report about their self-regulation skills, we still had to run some exploratory factor analysis to make sure that these factors were grouped in 2 categories that would make sense. And the grouping basically showed us 3 main consequences. First, 2 of the questions were not relevant for that specific cohort, so we ditched them. These are the 7 that survive. I don't know if I should point here or I should point there, or I should have a double pointer pointing to both places. Anyway, these are the 7 questions they survive, and the factor analysis grouped them into 2 final categories. So these 1, 2, 3, 4 were bundled together in what we call the positive self-regulation strategy, and these remaining 3 were grouped in what we call negative self-regulation strategy. Another way of looking at this is after the survey was collected and we identified these 2 groups, having high value in your positive self-regulation strategy means that a student is much more keen to adopt strategies that increase their self-regulation, and the opposite. The factor is that students reject any type of behavior that would increase their negatively involved in self-regulation. So these are our 2 variables or 2 factors that we're going to play with. Okay, so the second step in this factor analysis was to check for correlation. And again, I know correlation is not causality, and I actually end up explaining this to my students because I typically tell them that if they participate a lot in the forum, they typically get better scores. So they get backwards and say, okay, I'm going to write in the forum, and I'm probably going to increase my scores. And there you are. Correlation is not causality. So I explained them something like that. And this is the same. This is just seeing if things are moving in the same direction, right? And what we're having here is first some expected results. There is fairly low correlation between positive self-regulation strategy and negative self-regulation strategy, thank God. Then the academic performance, as you can see, there is, and this is the first interesting result, a very low negative correlation with positive self-regulation, which is like nothing. So this is the first kind of surprise. I mean, even though students might report positive self-regulation strategies, we still don't see an effect on the academic performance, whereas the negative one, it's a very significant one. The double asterisk, it's here. It's this level of significance. So what we're seeing here is that even though the questionnaire asks about positive and negative aspects of self-regulation, for our cohort in our environment, one of them is not correlating too much with academic performance, the other one is. And it's actually interesting because probably you need to look into your design and see what kind of elements are responsible for this variation, or even talk to your students and see if you can find out a little bit more what happens here. These are the rows you see here. These are the rows of the digital environment, or the digital footprint, what I call the digital footprint. And as you can see, we have some interesting correlations with positive self-regulation. Let me walk you a little bit through these columns. This is accessing a self-reflection tool to see what kind of things are happening or what kinds of things you're doing. This is the event count that tells us if they are reading the course notes. And you see a little bit of a significant correlation in there. So those students that are a bit more thorough reading the course notes and have high counts, they tend to correlate with positive self-regulation. This is probably the most important one, which is widespread access to different resources. So we have videos and questions, and what we're measuring there is how widespread access they have, and it makes sense, this is correlating. And the other ones, not so much with the positive correlation. And something similar happened here. Again, another interesting specific feature of this scenario is that even though we have negative self-regulation here, these digital footprints aspects don't seem to correlate. However, with academic performance, now we are getting much more higher values of correlation, some of them fairly high, right? Again, this one, and they are positive correlations. So a much more nuanced picture is beginning to emerge here. Seems like negative self-regulation, it's a bit more prominent. It has a bit more effect, or higher correlation, sorry. But then when it comes to the footprint, we're beginning to discover quite substantial correlation with academic performance. And finally, two more steps we did was, first, we did a clustering, and the clustering we only used the positive and negative self-regulation strategy, and we came up with two clusters. And these three numbers you see here and these three numbers you see here are the characterization of the clusters, and the remaining information is after we did the clustering, we inserted the difference with respect to the footprint, the digital footprint, to see if it made any, if it was significant, this difference. So first, let's look at these three columns over here, and the clusters come fairly straightforward. We almost have, not 50, but maybe 60-40. This is high-performing students and highly motivated or highly engaged with positive self-regulation strategies, and this other cluster is low-performing students with low or negative self-regulation strategies. And here you can see the statistics. These scores are all normalized, so when you see minus 0.46 means that I am on the negative side of the mean, positive, I'm on the other side. So as you can see, we have low academic performance, much lower than this one in these two clusters. We have also an important difference with the negative self-regulation strategy, and the same thing with the positive self-regulation strategy. All these three factors, as expected, are significant. And then when we throw in the digital footprint, basically what we are asking is the question, all right, so you went on to the cohort, you asked them about self-regulation, you divided it into two categories, the high and the low, for lack of a better name. Is there any difference with respect to the way they behave online? And we are beginning to see that for certain event counts, we do have a significant difference. So what we are beginning to realize is that these strategies that the students have that are different when they approach their course, the self-regulation strategies, they're actually somehow either mediated or related with the way they behave online, again, for this course. And perhaps the most relevant contribution of this study is when we obtain this structural equation model. And to be honest, when I saw these results, when things started to make a little bit more sense, and when we realized that we were in a much better position to start understanding what happens there. So what we are representing here is the influence that these three different factors have on academic performance. And negative self-regulation strategy have, as expected, a negative influence on academic performance, and it had certain level of significance that was important. We don't have, though, a very clear positive influence of self-regulation directly on academic performance. This number is much lower, or it's lower than this one, right? However, it is much larger when it is connected or influences the interaction with online activities. And these online activities, they do actually have a very positive influence on academic performance. So the type of picture that is emerging, and this was a little bit what we were after, is that for this case in particular, when we look at academic performance, the type of interactions or the intensity of these interactions of the students online, they actually have a big impact on academic performance. Whereas the self-regulation strategy, it's a little bit unclear. Definitely the negative self-regulation, we have a direct influence, but the positive self-regulation, we do have much more of an indirect influence. So those students that have a positive self-regulation strategy, those are much more influenced to go online and appreciate these resources and interact a lot. And then this has an effect on academic performance. Whereas with this one, if you see, there is no mediation by online activities. So for these students that have a negative self-regulation strategy, it doesn't matter if they interact or not with the online activities. And that, I guess, is the type of information that becomes useful then for a designer. You begin to understand that if I need to tackle negative self-regulation strategies, changing the online environment, this model is telling you, probably you shouldn't go that way. You probably have to think a little bit more in terms of addressing that negative self-regulation. Forget about tweaking too much the online activities because they don't seem to be mediating that process. So this is pretty much the type of conclusions we're reaching. It's still fairly preliminary, and Rob and I have increased a little bit the frequency of our arguments about these results, and we still need to unpack it a little bit more, but mostly what we are discovering is that when we try to reconcile these theory models with the data, we begin to explore, or we begin to see combinations that are not intuitive. You would say, oh, okay, I have an online environment and students have to do lots of things online. Great, so the more they work with online, the better. Not quite. And positive self-regulation is probably good, negative self-regulation is probably bad, and they'll have an impact on academic performance. Not quite. And this is the type of detail that this model is offering you. If you hear me talking a little bit before, I'm very much a fan of saying, okay, what now? I need to go back and say, what do I do now? As soon as I discover this beautiful, and this is my favorite question to Rob, say, okay, yeah, but what is this for? What do we do next edition, right? And I think we narrow it down. We need to consider these strategies to reduce this negative self-regulation. We need to tackle that explicitly. The structural equation model is very clear, saying this has a negative impact directly on academic performance. So see if you can redesign and perhaps encourage your students to do a bit more of the type of tasks that encourage self-regulation. Things like, for example, including these reflective tasks in the part of online. There is nothing like that right now in the course. And this is the next step that would give us another model and then do a before and after comparison and see if it has an effect. And then we complement this with a little bit of feedback about that self-reflection. So this person that is somehow portrayed as adopting a negative self-regulation strategy, we ask them to do self-reflection, and then we give them a little bit of a much more comprehensive feedback to make sure that these people are really embracing those type of activities. So these are the ideas or the consequences we derive from this study. And with this, the conclusions. Hopefully, we convince you, or we penetrate a little bit more this combination between qualitative, or rather theory-based model and data-intensive models. We explore this potential relationship. We combine these three data sources that I think are very relevant. We talk a lot about data, not so much about aspects like self-regulation, and we try to be loyal and try to address academic performance. Interestingly enough, for me, the most surprising thing, we don't have a very strong correlation between positive self-regulation and strategy and academic performance. There is a little bit of an influence when we put it in the online environment. And the structural equation modeling, I think, offer a picture that was not expected for us and allow us to think a little bit more about that. And we pointed out to these specific improvements in the design, which hopefully, once we tweak that design, we might see changes, and those changes hopefully improve the overall learning experience. And that's all. Thanks.
Thanks, Abelardo, for the talk. Questions?
Hi, very nice work. Can you go back to your structural equation model, please? So this might just be a small point, but I guess I would have interpreted this structural equation model a little bit different from what you said. So I'd like to say how I would interpret it and then have you tell me why I'm wrong. So I think you said that if you have the negative self-regulation strategies, it doesn't matter whether you interact with the online activities or not on your academic performance. But my interpretation of this model is that in this data, there wasn't any relationship between the negative self-regulation factors and the interactions with online activities. So you actually don't know whether.
Right. Okay. That's right, yeah. So this influence is not present, we could say that, but we don't know. Yeah, I agree. Okay. Good point.
Just quickly on that note, what's the R-squared explained of academic performance?
The R-squared, I knew you would ask me this question.
Sorry.
I think it is in the paper. I was looking at it this morning. So this model, the way we validated this model is we run a chi-square test, and then we use the root mean square error, and that was below 5%, 0.05, the error. The R-squared, I don't remember. I need to go back to the paper and check.
So I'm going to, I guess, continue the trend of methodology questions, but I have 3 issues. So I'll start with one, and maybe if that's too selfish, we'll stop after one. So the first question is, you took this instrument, the motivation and self-regulation instrument, and you took out the dimension that related to self-regulated learning, and it was 9 questions. And you know, I'm not very familiar with the instrument, but presumably it was validated through a large sample with a factor analysis that said this is one factor.
Yeah.
And then you took it with your sample and you further divided it into 2, which most likely reduces the reliability of each of the sub-dimensions. I mean, that's just almost always a rule if you take one instrument and can turn it into 2 dimensions. So why did you do that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The reason why we wanted to do that is because we wanted to start with a very simple division of approaches. Not so much because the questions, the way you let me go back. The way they are framed, they touch on different aspects, right? That might fragment a lot the type of questions we are trying to answer. So if we keep them separate and we say, I ask myself questions to make sure I know the material I've been studying. Again, this is much easier to say, well, this is probably a positive strategy for self-regulation. If we consider it completely isolated, then we would probably be answering much more precise questions about the use of the material, which is not what we are interested in. We are interested in just saying, are you adopting a positive or negative self-regulation? But I agree with you, we might lose precision with the instrument, with this classification.
Okay, and then I'll just quickly say the other 2 as comments, we can talk about them offline.
Okay.
But I think if you're going to do pairwise comparisons between these and your data, your interactive use of the data, you're going to do a lot of pairwise comparisons. Yeah. You should adjust your significance levels to account for the multiple comparisons, which would reduce your type 1 errors. Yeah. And then having done that, you took these continuous measures, like these, the self-regulation scales are continuous, and your other, your interaction with the system scales were continuous. Well, yeah, but then after doing the correlation analysis, you then did a clustering and then did another kind of discrete analysis on the same. So you took your continuous measures, discretized them, and then did the same analysis again, which is, probably not great. Okay, anyway, so thanks for entertaining the comments.
Okay, one more question.
Your path analysis shows a relationship between positive self-regulation and use of online resources, your digital footprint. Do your data allow going into the digital footprint to look for patterns that themselves might reflect regulation? And might that be another way of expressing what it is that students are regulating and whether there are relationships between, let's say, toe prints, if not footprints of things?
That's a very good question. We do have certain data that will allow us to unpack a little bit that because the type of resources and event counts are separated and the activities are somewhat different, but we need to work a little more about the type of self-regulation that each activity promotes. Some of them might have a higher level of self-regulation than others. We do have that data and we haven't thought about that, but that's probably something we can unpack.